Good morning, everyone. It's Gary at Soccer Pro, and today I have the honor of having Melanie Red with me from Melanie Red Performance Training. Today, we're going to be talking about how to create soccer speed in today's youth athletes. So, Melanie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Could you start off by telling everyone a little bit more about your background and what you do for kids today?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I love talking about this stuff. So, my background is almost 10 years ago. I started down the road in the fitness industry, but about 5 years ago, just wasn't really feeling that as much anymore. I still do that to a degree, but about 5 years ago, I started working in the high school athlete space and dipped my toe in the water. But then about 4 years ago is when I started working in the high school athlete space full time. Started with football. And then after that, it was a wrestling team at the same school. And then that quickly led to all sports, not just in that school, but I do some work with club sports in my local area and around the country. And then 11 months ago, when quarantine hit us all, I began building a consulting platform just for sport coaches to learn how to teach, coach, and correct every aspect of their own strength, speed, and injury prevention programs. And so right now I'm in the thick of scaling that platform and talking to and working with high schools all over the country and some middle schools too, but the majority of my work is in the high school.
So, you talk about different sports like football and wrestling, and obviously, we care most about soccer. That seems to be where
Mhm.
my heart is. So, when you look at the different aspects of athletes, what is going to be a different approach you take for a football player versus a soccer player? And just for the purpose of clarity, I know we get into this debate between calling soccer football or
Yeah.
whatever, but for this conversation, we're going to stick with football equals USA football with helmets,
American
pads,
football. Yeah. Yeah.
punting, kicking, blocking, and soccer
Correct.
is soccer. So let's get back
Correct.
to when we look at the difference between a football player and a soccer player, what are the different things that you need to consider when you're building up their program?
Well, the energy demands are different for football than they are for soccer. So, soccer is more of an endurance sport, although I think we're going to talk about this today that soccer is getting a lot faster and football is predominantly speed. I mean, the football game happens in about 7-second increments, and then there could be 2 minutes of doing nothing, or there could be 2 seconds of standing around. So the energy demands obviously are very different. So I always take that into account first. And then secondly, the durability demands are different. So soccer is a contact sport, whereas American football is a collision sport. And I think that people really need to understand the difference, between the two. Soccer having contact and kids do collide sometimes in soccer, but the point of football is to collide with another human being, right? So in American football, a tackle is like the equivalent of a car accident.
Right.
So if that person is not protected, if they're not durable, if certain training protocols haven't been in place, then their likelihood of getting hurt just goes higher and higher and higher. So not that soccer players don't need to be durable, because they certainly do. It's just a different kind of durability involved. But if you went into my weight room, what my soccer teams are doing might not look that different than what my football teams are doing. There's nuances in context that, are different. And soccer players probably not moving as heavy loads as the football team as a whole, but generally we're squatting, we're lunging, we're pushing, we're pulling, we're doing a lot of core. We're not recreating exercises for soccer players than what American football players are doing. It's just really program design is very slightly different. And the way I run those sessions in the weight room specifically would be a little different. I will keep a soccer weightlifting session moving quicker, a little less rest in between their set than I would allow on, for an American football team. So just like I said, it's really not huge differences. It's just little nuances here and there that we take into account for soccer versus another sport.
Right.
Wrestling, for example, is more endurance, but also requires bouts of explosion and it's brutal. Obviously, I would put that in like the combat sport
Hmm.
category. So those demands are slightly different. However, if you came to the weight room, the soccer workout and the wrestling workout would look very similar.
Well,
Because again, we're trying to keep in mind that these kids are required to be constantly moving in the soccer space for however long they're in that game, right? So however many minutes, it's typically, walk, jog, sprint,
yep.
change direction, jog, walk, sprint. It's like we have to kind of like take that into account when we're training.
Yeah, and at the start of every sport, it always starts with athletes. It doesn't matter what sport it is. You start as an athlete and then you
Right.
specialize into that sport. Now, one of the things we always talk about with soccer kids is ACL injuries, knee injuries in general, ankle injuries. But what I find with soccer kids is there's a strong base. They've got very strong, powerful legs, but their upper body is typically underdeveloped. They just don't have the arm strength, shoulder strength, core strength. And that's a big part of the game, though. I mean, you've got to
Yeah.
push people, you've got to make space, you've got to extend the arms, kind of,
Mm-hmm.
and keep people away from you. So when you're getting these kids in for soccer specific type of training, how are you treating the upper body versus the lower body? And do you balance that in a different way, or do you just keep it the same as, let's just call it athlete generic?
There's a heavy core focus, but by that I don't mean that we're doing like crunches and twists and things like that. It's more in terms of lifts and different exercises that are going to require the core to become strong in order to do effectively. So I love, for instance, for soccer players, I love hang cleans. And I think everybody should have those in their program, but only if you can teach them. It's a really technically difficult lift to teach and to coach. So if you can't do that, then there are other things, that you can do. But soccer players should learn how to generate that power from the core. They should be doing things like jumping and landing and, explosive movements, which we do a lot of that in the weight room. Or, if you don't have access to that, you can do that out on the field as well. But in terms of upper body, I'm always looking for just great range of motion and the ability to produce power. Soccer players don't use their upper body a whole lot, but a great throw in could make or break. It could make or break a game, right? So we want those athletes to be able to put that ball exactly where they want it. We want them to have accuracy and power behind that when they need it. So we train all of that just like we would with any athlete. And then in terms of upper body, it does help with speed, right? So if the core is weak and the upper body is weak, I mean, I think people often forget how much important an arm swing is in that sprinting or running pattern, right? And we never want to have imbalances where you mentioned, but a lot of times a soccer player will come into the weight room and they are so low body strength dominant and there's not a whole lot going on up top. And my
Right.
goal is to always kind of, balance that a little bit. I don't need them to be jacked by any sense of the of your imagination, but definitely want them to be functionally strong. And so that's always the question in my world is what does that even mean? And really it's just athletes need to be strong enough,
Yes.
right? Like they don't need to be, we don't need soccer players to look like football players. That would be a complete waste of our time. We just need them to be strong enough to be able to produce speed and power and change direction fluidly. And we need them to have enough endurance to get down the field, take a shot, hopefully score, and then keep doing that over and over and over again. So it's kind of on a case by case basis. I train entire teams, but if there's one athlete in particular or a few who really lack upper body strength, then I will make sure I'm coaching them to really kind of improve that strength every week. Just get a little bit stronger up top every week. And then once they get to the point where it's enough, then we don't have to worry about it as
Right.
much.
Yeah. I mean, technically, the game is supposed to not be played with the arms, but I can tell you that at Soccer Labs, we're always training these kids to make sure they get those arms out, make space. And you've got to have
Yeah.
enough strength to keep that opponent off of you. And you've got to have that space. And if you watch the pro game, the arms are going all the time. So you've got to
Yeah,
have the arm strength at
absolutely.
least to the point where you can keep that person off your shoulder, right? Keep them off just a
Mhm,
little bit to make that space so you can
mhm,
maneuver and operate with the ball. So again, let's circle back to some of these soccer specific things. You talked about doing the clean as a great workout or exercise for the core.
mhm.
What are some of the main things if you were to give coaches, let's say 4 things that they absolutely need to have incorporated into their program for their soccer players, what would those be?
Well, my non-negotiables are single leg strength movements. All of my soccer players do that, and we start that on the second week. And if they need modifications, then we'll give them modifications, but we're working to quickly get strong on one foot without the need for modifications. And then after that, we're looking to add load to that as quickly as possible. We're never going to add like a ton of weight to like a single leg, for instance, like a skater squat or a single leg rear deadlift, for glutes and hamstrings. But we definitely want to get soccer players on one foot as quickly as possible. We want to coach them through those movements, make sure that knee is tracking out over the pinky toe and it's not coming midline, and then getting strong and keeping that strength is, to me, it fills so many buckets that I will never not have single leg strength. I hate to say never, but I just can't imagine not having single leg strength be the focus, especially for soccer players because of the high incidence of knee ligament injuries. So,
Yeah, that's so important, keeping those kids injury free. All right. So you have a website, I'm assuming Melanie Red
mhm,
Performance Training is your company name. Is that
mhm.
also your URL?
It's mrperformancetraining.com.
Okay. So mrperformancetraining.com. And you're working with people locally, you're working with people all across the nation.
Mhm. It's a global thing now. I'm working with a grassroots organization, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say their name, so I'll just kind of be vague. But I'm working with a grassroots soccer organization to develop some training video content for their coaches, which they are going to translate to French for me. It's in an area of Africa that speaks French, so that's really exciting. I'm really excited to put some of those things together and to kind of take this whole thing global.
So let's break it down then. We've got the global aspect, we've got the national aspect, we have the local aspect. So let's just take each one and say if somebody wants to get a hold of you and bring you in for a local consultation or to develop their program or maybe to run their program, how do they start working with you at the local level?
Um, it depends on if it's a high school, then typically I will my conversation is with the athletic director of that high school. And in those situations, it's usually not one sport. The consulting that I do with high schools is typically for the entire school, minus maybe like the bowling team. Typically, may not work out. So in that instance, it would be athletic directors contacting me directly, and we're kind of setting up a time to meet with them and potentially head coaches in that scenario. Club organizations can just reach out to me directly, and that also includes meetings with whoever the club director is and typically their coaches. And then it just depends on if they want me on site in person or one of my coaches. Then we organize that and
Mm-hmm.
logistically and figure that out. Or for people who want to kind of just get the guidance and do it on their own or learn how to better coach their own teams, I have the consulting platform, which also includes my virtual training app. So within that space, there's like hours and hours of content that's just for coaches, for instance, that where they can learn, speed drills and how to teach and coach them and correct them. But if somebody wants me on site, then I'm pretty much doing all of that. Although I always highly encourage coaches, assistant coaches to be there for some
Sure.
of those sessions and to gain some sort of understanding.
Because it's
Something just
important that they
popped up.
can reinforce that message. I mean, after you walk out the door and they're doing their, let's say, training with you, and then they're going to go do their field training, whether it's football, soccer,
Right.
whatever, or court training, for basketball,
Right.
etc. They can't go and change everything. They have to start bringing
Mm-hmm.
those aspects onto that playing surface.
Right.
So it's important that the coaches understand it as well. So let's just
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about that app that you have, because I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important for people to understand how this thing operates. There's a lot of content on YouTube. There's a lot of content, let's say, in a lot of different apps. With your app, it sounds to me like you're saying not only do you have the training for the actual exercise, but you're putting coaching tips in there so the
Yeah.
coaches know what to look for when they're reinforcing the good habits and trying to get rid of the bad habits for those
Yeah.
drills.
Yeah. And really what the coach's content is me just trying to figure out, if I were in front of you and you said, teach me how to teach, coach, and correct this particular change of direction drill, and why do we do this, and how do we do this, and what are we looking for? So that content is not just the what, but it's the how. Okay, here's how you're going to go through this. But there's an interactive piece to that. I never want to just produce this content and then here you go, good luck. I don't like that. So I'm very much like, my business is very much based on building relationships and partnerships. And the interactive piece is really important to me. So a lot of times the coach will watch that content and then we'll talk about it. What did you mean by this? Or I know what you want me to do, but this kid his body won't do it. And then we have to talk through, those scenarios, and I'm asking questions. And, if all else fails, I've had coaches film their athletes and just send it to me. And I use coach's eye to slow it down and figure out what might be going on. When we're teaching athletes things, some athletes, their bodies just do whatever they want it to do. Right. And it's
Sure.
beautiful
Yeah, some
thing.
weird things
So
happen.
it's nice. It's nice when that happens. Some athletes don't understand at all what you're asking them to do. They mentally are not processing it. So there are ways to teach those athletes, and we call that a motor learning issue. But then there are athletes who they understand what you're asking them to do. They know exactly what you want them to do, but their bodies are just not doing it. Then we have an issue where we need to really kind of figure out, how are we going to help this athlete? We don't need to coach them anymore. They know exactly what we're asking them to do. It's just something's not firing right, or something is not computing within, and so those are the sorts of things that I'll help coaches through, which is really nice because it really takes the guesswork out of a lot of things that coaches have just been kind of really frustrated with. And so the entire platform works towards eliminating frustrations one by one, so we can just get to work and get these kids better and less injured, and everybody has more fun in that scenario.
And video certainly does help when kids can see firsthand what they're doing wrong. A lot of times they don't actually believe you. If you keep telling them,
Correct.
it's like, do it this way, and they keep looking at you like, I am doing it that way, until
You're
we
not.
pull out the iPad.
Yeah.
I mean, oftentimes it's as simple as pulling out an iPad, videoing them doing it, and then showing them the video on the iPad and say, see?
Yes. I think that's
So
a really valuable tool. And we all have our phones in our pockets, or in our bag, right? At any
Yep.
given time. I think, I think coaches have to be careful. I think you have to remind, or, make that athlete aware that you're not going to post this on social media. And, when I pull out the phone and start recording, and my kids are like, no, don't. And I'm like, I'm not going to expose you on Twitter. Don't worry. This is for us. I'm going to send you guys the video, or you person, the video, so you can see. And I want you to watch that. And then I want you to do these things that I'm asking you to do. And we're going to shoot it again in a couple weeks and compare. And that's a really, really valuable tool to use. It's hard to use it for the whole entire team, especially if
Right.
your roster is, in the football space, the roster is 70 kids or more in some instances. But in those instances where you're really having trouble getting through, that can be a really easy and quick way to just get that athlete to understand, okay, my body is actually not doing that.
Yep.
I can see it now. So that alone is a really good tool. And then, you have to understand though, how to fix the movement patterns and improve on, certain weaknesses on top of that. It's not enough to just show them how how it looked in the moment. We have to be able to enhance or repair whatever might be going on.
Right, right. So what are some of the things that you've been able to accomplish? We've talked about the things that you do, all right, which is
Mm-hmm.
to help these kids get faster, reduce the injuries. And you're involved in the high schools and multiple different school districts, et cetera. What are some of the success stories that you've had with the programs after you've gone into some of these high schools? If we look at, let's say, an injury rate before you appeared and then
Mm-hmm.
an injury rate after you've instituted your programs.
Yeah. So the injury is something that I keep really close track of. In my world, it's not acceptable for athletes to get hurt in training. So no one gets injured in the weight room. And I work really hard to prevent or avoid injuries in, when we're speed training or doing conditioning or change of direction, and carefully plan out those sessions for the whole year. So if I get a year with the team, or if I get 4 months with the team, it's programmed so that we're meeting the athletes where they are, and then we're working to like slowly move the needle. And athlete training is a slow cook process. So you need at least 4 months, in my opinion, with a team to get them prepared for their in season. And then once they go in season, some teams I work with in season, some teams I do not. It really just depends on scheduling. So, but the coach will have a program established for an in-season strength and recovery. Really, is what we're after by the time we get to the demands of in-season. And I keep really close track of the injuries, when they're happening, how they're happening, even like what period or quarter of the game is it? What was the scenario? I keep really close tabs on that stuff because I want to know if there's something that I missed, if that happens. And a lot of times it's a contact issue, so you can't prevent all injuries, by the way, and especially in contact or collision. But I am happy to say that the teams that I work with have very few, if any at all, season-ending injuries. The COVID threw a big wrench in that, for sure. In Ohio, we had 5 months without training for our fall teams. So for the first year since I started full-time in the high school team space, I had 2 football players had knee injuries this year, and one was non-contact and one was an awful contact injury. And I have to say, though, neither one of those was surprising because neither athlete worked out at all during the 5 months that we were off. And that was the biggest frustration for me. I was like, I just want to go to these kids' houses, and like, you can't do that because it's COVID, right? So I wanted to like go knock on doors and be like, why aren't you logging your workouts in the app? And I don't say that to dunk on these kids at all. I really don't. And that was a really tough time. And everybody was just kind of getting by. And it was emotional. It was very difficult for teenagers, all of a sudden thrust into online school and all of that. So I don't say that to be, negative, but definitely had some injuries there. Although my soccer teams were pretty injury free, and I actually only got like 6 weeks with them. So, we had one, but it was an old ACL tear that never fully healed, that got retorn. But yeah, and that was that we were aware of. Like we knew something was wrong, and the coaches and myself and the athletic training staff had been communicating on it. Just things didn't look right. But at the end of the day, a lot of times an athlete knows something's wrong and they don't say anything because they don't want to lose out on playing. And I've seen a couple of those scenarios, but there's nothing where I've been just shocked, like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that happening. I take that back. I had one football player, strongest kid I've ever seen, brilliant athlete, get tackled. And it was like a 3-person tackle. And I was standing right there on the sideline, and they grabbed the knee and and it was, I knew instantly. It was actually one of the worst moments of my career, because I literally before my eyes could see opportunity was going to be lost. Kid gets surgery and then COVID hits. So
Right.
PT wasn't very good for people who had surgery,
Well,
right before COVID.
if we go back to just working with the high schools, there's certain rules and regulations depending on where you live, what state you're in, what association you're in, et cetera. Are you able to work with the team in the off season because you're not technically their high school coach?
Yes, schools contract me. So, and contracts can look a little bit different, but yes. So if the school contracts me to come in and start working with their team in the off season, there are rules about whether or not we can make it mandatory. So that's where it becomes incredibly important for teams to have a really good team culture of accountability and attendance. And generally, these kids want to be in the weight room, especially now, especially post quarantine, where then, we used to kind of have to drag them to the weight room and like, you guys have to do this. Come on, let's go. And it's not like that anymore. And I would say one of the bright sides of COVID is that I see on a large scale this massive appreciation for the privilege to play a sport and a huge desire to want to train. I don't think kids are going to take that for granted ever again until the next generation comes along who doesn't really remember or wasn't around for COVID. But I'm riding that wave because I don't have to motivate right now. I mean, these kids show up and they're ready to work and we just have a great time doing it, which I just think is really awesome.
Right. Well, that's the lecture I give the kids too. It's like, if you think it's punishment to have to run, ask the kid that has the knee injury how much punishment it is for him not to run. So
and injuries are obviously, they're going to happen. But I just think we should not throw our hands up and say, oh, it's just part of the game. I think we should be working towards reducing the number of injuries in every scenario as much as possible. Knowing that I'm not Superwoman. I can't create everybody to have this perfect body where everything works right all the time. It's just not that's not how our bodies work. But I think I have to try. Yep. I do. I think that's where, that's where the magic is, trying to get better, stronger, faster, trying to create that durability and just watching and observing and trying to troubleshoot and problem solve is just kind of like that constant dynamic that's always going on for me. And I like that. I enjoy that.
I know we're on a hard stop here, Melanie. So before we go though, I want to make sure that everyone has your contact information. And remember, if you're a coach that wants a coaching program, the program not only gives you the curriculum, but also the coaching points on how to coach that curriculum, things to look for, things to help you correct the things that are wrong for players. You can get into the program as well from that perspective. There's local, there's global. And Melanie, one more time, how do they get a hold of you if they want to start one of these programs?
Probably the best way is to find me on Facebook, Melanie Red, or you can search Melanie Red Performance Training. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn as well, all of the social media channels. Also, my email is melanie@mrperformancetraining.com. And I did want to add, by the way, the programming for schools locally or on a consulting basis is custom programming. So they're designed around the specific needs and facility or lack of facility that a team or school may have.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Melanie, thank you for stopping out today. And I look forward to talking to you in the very near future on additional topics that you're an expert in.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Gary. I appreciate it.